What happens when a Hollywood legend walks into daytime television and refuses to play by its rules? When Clint Eastwood, the man who built his legacy on silence and steel, faces off against Joy Behar, the queen of confrontation, the result isn't just an argument. It's a televised duel where pride, ego, and truth collide in front of millions. This isn't just a heated exchange. It's a raw collision between Hollywood's last stoic and daytime TV's loudest provocateur. A moment that exposes just how distorted modern media has become. Clint Eastwood walked onto the stage with that same quiet confidence that had carried him through half a century of Hollywood. No flash, no fake grin, just calm presence. Joy Behar leaned back in her chair, smiling wide enough for the cameras, but there was something behind it, something sharp. To the audience, she looked friendly. To Clint, she looked ready. He wasn't here for a fight. He'd come to talk about redemption, about giving people another chance in a world that rarely does. But Joy, she'd already made up her mind that this wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a showdown, and she was ready to pull the trigger. At first, everything seemed normal. Whoopi introduced Clint with her usual warmth, Sarah Haynes leaned in with that polished enthusiasm, and Clint responded with simple gratitude. He spoke about his new film, about how it was really a story of second chances, how people could fall hard and still find a way to stand back up. His tone was low and steady, his words unpolished but real. The audience listened like they were hearing an old friend talk. Even the hosts seemed caught up in it, except Joy. She watched him the way a hunter watches movement in tall grass, patient but restless, her fingers lightly tapping the table in front of her. Every few minutes, she smiled, but her eyes never softened. She wasn't listening for meaning. She was listening for weakness. Clint didn't notice it at first, or maybe he did, and just didn't care. He kept talking about truth, how the hardest thing in Hollywood wasn't fame or failure, but honesty. When he said the word truth, Joy's eyes flickered, just for a second, like she'd been waiting for that exact moment. The air in the studio felt different now. The warmth that had carried the conversation vanished the moment Joy leaned in, her smile still painted on, but her tone turning sharp. You talk about redemption, Clint. But tell me, how do your political choices fit that idea? The words hit the room like a glass dropped on tile. Every head at the table turned toward her, but she didn't care. She wasn't asking a question. She was throwing a punch. Clint froze for just a beat, not because he was caught off guard, but because he was measuring her. The lines around his eyes tightened, and the faintest hint of a frown crossed his face. He'd been through war zones of interviews before, but this one felt different. He could feel the heat rising off her words, provocation disguised as curiosity. He finally spoke, his voice low but solid, the kind of tone that made people stop mid-breath. Which choices are you referring to? It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. He didn't blink, didn't look away. Joy met his stare with a smirk that looked rehearsed, the smirk of someone who thinks they've just cornered the legend. Oh, you know, she said, her tone deliberately casual. The ones involving men who don't exactly respect women. She dragged out the last few words, letting them hang in the air like smoke, watching to see if he'd flinch. Clint didn't. He leaned back slightly, one arm resting on the chair, eyes locked on her as if he were staring down an opponent in a saloon standoff. That's a bold claim, he said quietly. You sure you're asking or accusing? Joy laughed under her breath, pretending it was lighthearted, but everyone could see the tension in her jaw. I'm just asking what people at home want to know, she said, her tone sharpening with each syllable. You talk about truth, redemption, integrity. but you've supported men who've said some pretty ugly things about women. How does that line up? She leaned forward, elbows on the table, like a prosecutor waiting for her witness to sweat. Clint tilted his head, studying her for a long moment before replying. You know, Joy, I've spent my life surrounded by people from every walk of life. Actors, writers, crew members, people who worked their hands raw to make a movie happen. I don't judge them by what others say about them. I judge them by how they treat the people standing next to them when no one's watching. His words weren't angry. They were cuttingly calm. The audience, unsure whether to clap or hold their breath, stayed silent. Joy wasn't backing off. Her smile tightened, and she leaned even closer. So you're saying all that stuff, what they've said, what they've done, doesn't bother you? You just overlook it? Clint gave a small shake of his head. No, I'm saying I don't take moral lectures from talk show hosts looking for a viral moment. The line landed like a quiet thunderclap. Joy's smile froze, but she tried to recover with a laugh that didn't sound natural. Oh, come on, she said, her voice rising an octave. You're really going to play that card? Clint's reply was simple, deliberate, and deadly calm. Respect isn't declared in tweets. It's earned in life. He let the words linger, his tone steady as stone. And it's lost when people trade honesty for applause. That last sentence sliced through the studio like cold air. Even Whoopi glanced down, as if to break eye contact with what was happening between them. Joy's cheeks flushed slightly, though she tried to hide it. For the first time, she looked unsettled. Clint didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Joy forced a laugh, waving her hand like she was brushing it off. You know what, Clint? You sound like one of your old Western characters. Stoic, self-righteous, acting like you've got all the answers. Clint gave a small, knowing grin. Maybe, he said, leaning forward. But at least those characters stood for something. That was it. The audience didn't move, didn't clap. Joy Behar sat up straighter, her pen tapping against the table as her patience ran thin. Clint Eastwood had kept his calm through everything she'd thrown at him, and that only made her angrier. You can't dodge forever, she said, her tone sharper now, words cutting through the silence. People deserve answers. The studio lights seemed to flare a little brighter, as if reflecting her rising tension. Clint didn't move. He just looked at her with that quiet steadiness, the same look that made villains freeze in his old movies. And they deserve better questions, he replied simply. The audience couldn't tell if they should clap or hold their breath. It wasn't loud, but the way he said it left no room for argument. Joy blinked, momentarily thrown off, but her pride pushed her forward. Oh, that's clever, she said, letting out a dry, humorless laugh, spoken like a man who's allergic to accountability. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as if she'd just scored a point. Clint tilted his head slightly, that familiar half-smile forming at the corner of his mouth. Accountability, he repeated, his tone calm, but with a sting that carried through the room. Coming from someone who's never been accountable for a single fact, she's twisted on air? The words were quiet, precise, and deadly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. It landed like a slap that echoed louder than a shout ever could. Joy's smirk disappeared. She tried to laugh it off, but it came out thin, brittle. Oh, please, Clint, don't try to tell me about honesty, she snapped, her voice climbing higher. You've spent years defending people who wouldn't know the truth if it walked up and hit them. Clint gave a small chuckle, the kind that said he wasn't taking the bait. I've spent years, he said slowly, making my own opinions, not reading them off a teleprompter. The line hit her like a jab to the ribs. Her mouth opened, then closed again. For a moment, the queen of quick comebacks had nothing to say. But Joy wasn't about to surrender her stage. She leaned forward again, voice firm but cracking at the edges. You think just because you made a few movies about heroes, that gives you the moral high ground? You play tough guys for a living, Clint. That doesn't make you one. Clint's eyes narrowed slightly. You think sitting behind a desk, taking cheap shots at people makes you brave? He said quietly. The calmness in his voice made it even more dangerous. I've stood in front of people my whole life, some who cheered, some who booed, but I never hid behind applause. The tension in the studio was unbearable now. Even the crew had stopped moving. Joy's voice rose, her words spilling faster, angrier. You're deflecting! You can't handle being challenged. Clint shook his head slowly. No, Joy. You mistake disagreement for disrespect. There's a difference. That one line changed the energy completely. The audience could feel it. Clint had just taken control. Joy's hands were clenched into fists on the table, her face flushed, her voice trembling somewhere between anger and frustration. She tried to fire back again, but Clint leaned forward, his tone so steady it was almost whisper quiet. You've confused volume for power, Joy. They're not the same thing. The words hit her like a final shot. It wasn't just a comeback, it was a statement of dominance. The kind of line that ends a duel without needing a gun. For a moment, Joy couldn't speak. She just stared at him, chest rising and falling, searching for something, anything, to say that could match him. But there was nothing left. Clint sat back in his chair, calm and unshaken, while Joy looked like someone who'd just realized she'd been outplayed at her own game. The air in the studio hung heavy, the silence thick and electric. Every person watching knew it. Clint Eastwood had just turned the talk show into his own movie scene, and Joy Behar was the one left standing in the dust. Joy's face hardened. The polite, TV-friendly smile she'd been wearing was gone now, replaced by something raw and defensive. This is my show, she said, her voice rising, each word like a jab. My house. I set the rules here. Clint didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just gave a small nod, the kind that somehow said, You just proved my point. Every house reflects its owner, he replied evenly. Yours seems built on outrage. The words were simple, but the way he said them made them sting. There was no anger in his tone, just the calm certainty of a man who had seen every kind of fight and knew exactly when to draw. Joy's jaw tightened. She leaned forward, determined not to lose the room. Outrage, she repeated, laughing sharply. You're one to talk, Clint. You've had your share of moments that made people wonder if you'd finally lost it. Her voice dripped with mock sympathy as she added, That bizarre stunt you pulled at the convention? Talking to an empty chair? Didn't people think you'd gone off the deep end? A few people in the audience gave nervous laughs, unsure if it was safe to react. Joy smirked, satisfied that she'd landed a hit. But Clint just smiled, slow, measured, knowing. I was speaking to an empty chair, Joy, he said, his tone soft but sharp as glass. You've been sitting in one your whole career. The room froze. If there was sound, it wasn't from the audience. It was from the kind of silence that feels deafening. Even Joy stopped breathing for half a second. Her face went still, then flushed red as the realization of what he'd just said sank in. She tried to force a laugh, but it came out choked, awkward. Oh, that's cute, she managed, but her voice had lost its edge. Clint leaned back slightly, still calm, almost gentle. You know, he continued, you call yourself a journalist, but you've never once asked a question, that made someone think. Only one that made someone trend. Joy's eyes flickered. She was losing her rhythm, and everyone could see it. She tried to recover, gesturing toward the camera. "I ask the questions people care about," she snapped. Clint didn't even raise his voice. "No," he said quietly. "You ask the questions that make you the story." That was it, the final blow in this round. Joy's face tightened, her mouth opening as if to respond, but nothing came out. Clint sat there, still and unshaken while she tried to gather herself. For years, she'd been the one controlling the tempo of interviews, deciding who spoke and who got silenced. But not today. The control had slipped, and everyone in the studio knew it. What was supposed to be her domain, her house, was now Clint Eastwood's battlefield. And he wasn't even breaking a sweat. The room felt heavier now, like the air itself had turned against Joy. She could feel her pulse in her neck, could hear the silence pressing in on her from every side. "You can't come on my stage and insult me," she shouted, slamming her hand against the table. The sound echoed, sharp and hollow, like the crack of a whip. The other hosts went rigid. No one dared to move. Clint didn't even flinch. He just turned his head slowly toward her, his eyes steady, voice low and cutting. "I didn't come here to insult you, Joy," he said. "You did that the moment you mistook provocation for truth." The words hung there, slicing through the room like cold steel. Joy froze, mouth slightly open, unsure how to respond. Clint's tone wasn't angry. It was calm in a way that made it even more devastating. It was the tone of someone who'd already won. "Don't twist this," Joy snapped, her voice trembling as she leaned forward, trying to regain control. "You came here with an attitude, Clint. You think you're too good to be questioned?" Clint raised an eyebrow, his tone staying even, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "No," he said. "I just don't mistake shouting for courage." The line hit her straight in the chest. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers tapped nervously on the table. "Oh, that's rich," she sneered, forcing a laugh that sounded like it hurt. "The tough guy from the Westerns wants to lecture me on courage. You're hiding behind that calm act because you can't handle being challenged." Clint leaned in slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "Joy," he said quietly, "you confuse confrontation with conviction. You don't care about truth. You care about being right." There was no venom in his tone, just clarity, the kind that stripped away all her defenses. For a moment, she didn't speak. You could almost see her brain racing, trying to find the next jab. But nothing came. The silence stretched too long, and it started to show on her face. She couldn't take it. Her voice cracked as she snapped, "Security!" The word burst out of her like steam from a boiling kettle. Heads turned. The audience gasped softly, unsure if she was serious. Even the crew looked around, frozen between professionalism and disbelief. Clint blinked once, then chuckled. An honest, low, weary laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest. "Security," he said, shaking his head slightly. "What are they going to do, Joy?" "Protect your ego?" The studio fell into stunned quiet. Joy opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her face flushed red. "You think you can just come in here and walk all over me?" she shouted, voice cracking again. "You're on my show, Clint." Clint stood his ground, still seated, but his presence filled the room. "Then maybe you should act like the host," he said evenly. "Because right now, you sound like someone who lost her own script." For a moment, the two just stared at each other, neither willing to blink first. Joy's hands were gripping the table as if she could physically hold her control in place. Clint didn't move. His gaze was steady, his voice calm, his breathing slow. When Joy finally looked away, just for a breath, the energy in the studio shifted. The audience didn't need to clap to know what had just happened. Clint Eastwood had won the duel, not with force, but with silence. Clint finally broke the stillness. He didn't rise, didn't gesture. He just turned slightly toward the main camera, his face steady, voice measured and low. "You want truth?" he began, his eyes locked on the millions watching at home. "Here it is. I came to talk about redemption. Instead, I walked into a trap." His tone didn't rise or fall. It carried the weight of exhaustion and clarity, the sound of a man who'd seen the world spin long enough to know when something's gone wrong. "This, right here," he said, motioning slightly toward the table. "This is what passes for dialogue now. Manufactured outrage. People don't talk to understand anymore. They talk to perform. Every question is a headline waiting to happen, and every answer is just ammunition." His words hung in the air like smoke. Every syllable hit differently, the truth in them undeniable. You could feel the atmosphere shift. Even those who disagreed with him couldn't look away. It wasn't just a guest defending himself. It was a man holding a mirror up to an entire culture. The lights above hummed faintly, and the cameras kept rolling, capturing something raw, something unscripted. The audience didn't cheer, didn't move. No one dared interrupt. That silence broke when Joy jumped back in, her voice sharp and shaking, almost pleading, but dressed up as fury. "You think you can humiliate me on my own show?" she snapped, her tone climbing higher, her words more frantic than firm. Clint turned his head toward her, slow and deliberate. The look he gave wasn't angry. It was disappointed, almost sad. "No, Joy," he said softly. "You've been doing that all by yourself for years." I just held up the mirror. The words cut deeper than any insult could. It wasn't cruel. It was surgical, precise, devastating in its calmness. Joy froze, her mouth opening as if to respond, but nothing came out. You could see the rage in her eyes flicker into something else, something closer to realization, or maybe fear. For a long, unbearable second, it was as if the entire room stopped breathing. There was no applause, no cue cards, no forced laughter to smooth things over, just silence, thick, electric, and suffocating. It wasn't the silence of confusion or shock. It was the kind of silence that comes when someone finally says what everyone's been thinking, but no one's had the courage to say. Clint sat there, unmoving, his eyes still fixed on Joy, while the cameras kept rolling. And for the first time in years, a talk show known for noise, for chaos, for endless chatter, was completely, terrifyingly quiet. For a moment, Joy just sat there, silent, breathless, and cornered. Her pride screamed louder than reason, and that's when it happened. She leaned forward, eyes burning, voice trembling with venom. "You're a has-been, Clint." The world's moved on. The line was meant to sting, to reclaim some control, but it came out shaky, desperate, almost pleading. Clint didn't react right away. He simply looked at her, his gaze calm and unshaken. When he finally spoke, his voice was so cold it didn't need volume. "And yet," he said, pausing for just long enough to let the silence stretch, "here you are, still making a living, talking about people who have." It hit her like a physical blow. There was no comeback, no witty retort, nothing left to reach for. The audience stayed dead quiet. You could hear the hum of the lights, the faint whir of the cameras, and the sound of her breath. Fast, uneven. Clint leaned back once more, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached up, unclipped his microphone, and set it on the table. The small click of plastic on wood sounded louder than any applause could have. He stood. No music, no signal to cut to commercial, just the sound of his boots on the studio floor, steady and deliberate. Each step was like a hammer driving in the last nail of a coffin. The man who had faced down outlaws and villains on screen was now walking off a stage that felt smaller with every stride he took. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The silence followed him, thick and undeniable. The camera caught him in profile as he reached the edge of the set, tall, composed, completely in control. Behind him, Joy Behar sat frozen. Her face was red, her chest heaving, eyes darting around for something, anything, to say. But there was nothing left. The set felt colder now, the light harsher. Clint's chair sat empty, the microphone still resting on the table like proof of what had just happened. The camera lingered on her for a moment, and that was when the reality hit. She wasn't the host anymore. She was the story. Clint's words from earlier echoed in the silence, lingering like a ghost. You wanted a viral moment. He'd said it casually, almost like a warning. Now she had it, but not the kind she'd planned. She wanted to expose him, to make headlines at his expense. Instead, she'd handed him one final, defining scene. The moment when a man who built his career on stoic silence used it to dismantle a woman who lived off noise. When the studio lights finally dimmed, the image that stayed wasn't Joy's anger. It was Clint's calm walk out of frame. No curtain call, no applause. Just a quiet reminder that sometimes dignity makes the loudest exit of all. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, no one said a word. There was no wrap-up, no forced laughter to smooth things over. The silence said everything. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, heavy, reflective, undeniable. No amount of editing or spin could change what had just happened. Clint Eastwood didn't just leave a show that afternoon. He left a message hanging in the air, one that every person in that studio would remember long after the lights dimmed. The headlines would come later, but the truth had already been written in the silence itself. Words, when spoken with truth, don't need volume. They just need courage. By the time the clip hit the internet, it wasn't Joy Behar trending. It was Clint. People replayed the moment over and over again, not for the drama, but for the calm. In a world addicted to noise, his restraint felt radical. Commentators called it the monologue that broke television. Others said it was a masterclass in composure. But for most who watched, it was something simpler, a reminder that dignity still has a place in public life. Clint Eastwood didn't storm off that set. He didn't shout, didn't gloat. He just walked away, steady as ever, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly realized what real strength looks like. He didn't just exit a stage, he redefined it. That day, he showed that silence can be louder than outrage, that calm can be more cutting than anger, and that truth, when spoken plainly, doesn't need to be shouted to shake the world. And Joy Behar, who had made a career out of interrupting others, finally understood what it felt like to be cut off, not by noise, but by truth. Her show would continue. The lights would come back on. The applause sign would blink again, but nothing would erase that moment. The day she tried to corner Clint Eastwood and ended up facing herself instead. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more moments that redefine truth, courage, and the meaning of standing your ground. Stay tuned for the next story, where words become battles and silence speaks louder than outrage.